In 1510, a young lawyer walked into a cathedral courtroom and spent the next several weeks defending 1,000,000 rats. He won, and in doing so, accidentally invented the modern concept of a fair trial. This is the gallows and quill archive, where the dust of centuries hides the most extraordinary secrets of human justice. We often look back at the 16th century as an era of awakening, a time of renaissance, artistic triumph, and scientific curiosity. Yet beneath the polished surface of this new world, the deep, dark roots of medieval dread still held the human mind in a suffocating grip. To understand what we are about to uncover, one must understand the absolute fragility of life. In the year 1510, picture the historic province of Burgundy, France. More specifically, the ancient walled town of Autumn. Autumn had passed. The cellars of the local peasantry should have been overflowing with the golden bounty of the earth. In these times, harvest was not a matter of commerce. It was the fragile shield that stood between a family and a slow, agonizing winter death. If the barley failed, the village starved. It was as simple and as brutal as that. But that year, a silent, ravenous plague descended upon the fields of autumn. It did not arrive with the thunder of marching armies or the visible horror of a burning sky. It came from beneath the soil. It began with a faint, rhythmic scratching beneath the floorboards. Then came the midnight rustling in the granaries. Within weeks, the collective shadow of millions of tiny, sharp teeth fell upon the countryside. The autumn crops, the precious, life-sustaining barley and rye, were being systematically decimated from the inside out. It was an army of rats. To the modern mind, a rodent infestation is a matter for traps and poisons. But to the 16th century mind, this was something far more sinister. This was not a mere biological nuisance, it was a cosmic assault. The peasants looked out over their ruined, chewed-up fields and saw the literal manifestation of demonic malice. They believed the earth itself had turned against them, whispered into rebellion by unclean spirits. The local authorities were utterly powerless. Poisons failed. Terriers grew exhausted, and the sheer volume of the grey tide seemed to mock human effort. As panic turned to absolute despair, the desperate populace turned to the only power they believed could command the forces of darkness, the Holy Church. The citizens of Autumn marched to the Grand Cathedral, demanding that the bishop take immediate, supernatural action. They did not ask for prayers. They demanded a trial. They demanded that the law of God be brought down upon the heads of the beasts. And so, the machinery of the ecclesiastical court, a system designed for heretics, witches, and devils, was slowly and heavily cranked into motion to face an enemy that knew nothing of human sin. In the ecclesiastical legal system of the time, an ongoing disaster could be halted by a formal curse, an excommunication. But the church maintained that you could not rightfully curse any entity without a fair, lawful trial. Justice, no matter how absurd the defendant, had to be performed with absolute, immaculate precision. The prosecutor stood before the judge and formally laid out the charges. The defendants were accused of grand larceny, malicious destruction of private property, and threatening the lives of the Christian community by creating an artificial famine. But this created an immediate, bizarre logistical nightmare. How do you serve a legal subpoena to 1,000,000 rats? The law had an answer for everything. If a defendant had no fixed address and could not be reached by hand, the law dictated that the summons must be read aloud in public spaces, where the accused were most likely to reside. Imagine the scene: a solemn, robed court officer, flanked by nervous guards, marching out into the windswept, ruined fields of Burgundy. He stands at the edge of the chewed-up barley, unrolls a heavy parchment scroll sealed with wax, clears his throat, and reads a formal command into the empty air. He orders all the rats of the province of Autumn to appear at the cathedral court on a specific date, at a specific hour, to answer for their crimes against humanity. This ritual was repeated at every major crossroads, outside every crowded granary, and in the market squares of all neighboring villages. The legal notice echoing off stone walls while the local townspeople watched in stunned, superstitious silence. The date of the trial was set. The prosecutor was confident. In 99% of these bizarre animal trials, the animals naturally failed to show up. When they didn't appear, the judge would simply declare them guilty in absentia, issue a formal decree of excommunication, and curse them to death. It was a pre-written script, a legal theatre designed to comfort the panicked populace. But the court had made one crucial, fatal miscalculation. To ensure the trial looked entirely legitimate, the judge was required by ancient statute to appoint an official public defender to represent the accused. It was supposed to be a hollow, symbolic gesture, a thankless job given to a low-ranking lawyer who would simply stand there, nod, and accept the inevitable verdict. Instead, the court appointed a young, fiercely ambitious, and terrifyingly brilliant lawyer. His name was Barthélemy de Chasseneuz. Chasseneuz did not look at this assignment as a joke, nor did he look at it as a career-ending humiliation. He looked at the heavy parchment charges, looked at his absent, furry clients, and saw the opportunity of a lifetime. He realized that if he could use the absolute letter of the law to defend the most indefensible creatures on earth, he would become completely untouchable in the legal world. When the morning of the trial arrived, the cathedral hall was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with the scent of incense, wet wool, and tense anticipation. The prosecutor adjusted his robes, ready for a quick victory. The judge took his seat, looked down at the empty bench where the defendants were supposed to be, and prepared to close the case. But before the gavel could fall, young Barthélemy de Chasseneuz stepped forward into the center of the courtroom, adjusted his spectacles, and threw his very first legal hand grenade. "Your Honor," he began, his voice ringing clearly off the high stone arches, "my clients are law-abiding subjects of the realm, and they harbor no disrespect toward this court. However, I must formally object to these proceedings on the grounds of a fundamental procedural flaw. The summons issued by this court was completely illegal." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor's smile vanished. "The law dictates," Chasseneuz continued, "that a summons is only valid if it gives all defendants a fair and equal notice to appear. This court issued a single, localized command here in autumn, but the charge states, 'The rats of the province.' My clients are scattered across hundreds of square miles, inhabiting every field, every barn, and every cellar, from here to the borders of the next province. To hold a trial today would be a violation of divine justice. How can we condemn an entire population when the vast majority of them have never even heard that a court date was set?" The judge was trapped by his own system. He ruled in favor of the defense. The trial was suspended, and the court clerks were ordered to travel to every single parish, every isolated hamlet, and every rural crossroads in the entire territory of Burgundy to read the subpoena aloud. It took weeks. The cost of the trial was skyrocketing, but Chasseneuz had accomplished his first major victory. He had forced the human legal system to treat a plague of rodents with the exact same procedural respect it would afford a high-ranking nobleman. When the appointed day finally arrived for the second time, the tension in autumn was suffocating. The judge took his seat, banged his gavel, and looked down at the floorboards. Once again, not a single rat had crawled into the courtroom. The prosecutor leaped to his feet, triumphant. "The notice has been served to every corner of the earth, Your Honor. The defendants have willfully ignored the command of the church. I demand an immediate verdict of guilt and the instant pronouncement of the curse." The crowd cheered, but Barthélemy de Chasseneuz slowly rose from his bench, entirely unbothered by the hostility in the room. "Your Honor," Chasseneuz said, his tone dripping with calm assurance, "it is true that my clients have not arrived, but this is not an act of rebellion or contempt. They desperately wish to come to court, but they are physically prevented from attending by a condition of absolute mortal terror." The courtroom fell dead silent. "The law explicitly states," Chasseneuz explained, "that a defendant is legally excused from attending a trial if the journey to the courthouse poses a direct immediate threat to their life. And who are the plaintiffs in this case? The citizens of Autumn. And what occupies the streets of Autumn outside this very cathedral? Cats, thousands of cats, owned by the very people who brought these charges. My clients are fully aware of the summons, but the moment they leave their burrows to march to this court, they must run a gauntlet of death. Hunted, torn to pieces, and slaughtered on the public roads by the plaintiffs' own domestic beasts. He turned back to the judge. Therefore, I demand that before my clients are penalized for their absence, this court must compel the plaintiffs to provide a massive financial bond, guaranteeing the safety of the defendants. The citizens of Autumn must lock away every single cat, hound, and predator in the province, and take full legal and financial responsibility if a single one of my clients is harmed on their way to this trial. The prosecutor sat down, utterly speechless. The wealthy citizens in the gallery looked at each other in absolute horror. Lock up every cat in Burgundy, take financial responsibility for the safety of a rat. It was an impossible, absurd demand. Chasseneuz had turned the logic of medieval justice completely on its head. The judge looked out over a courtroom, paralyzed by its own devotion to form. The wealthy plaintiffs, who had entered the cathedral demanding divine vengeance, now sat in stunned silence. The landowners flatly refused to grant the guarantee of safe passage. With no other legal recourse, bound by the strict precedents of canon law that Barthélemy de Chasseneuz had so brilliantly weaponized, the judge had no choice. The grand historical trial against the rats of Autumn was indefinitely adjourned. The case, for all practical purposes, was completely dismissed. The rats had won. Following his brilliant defense, Chasseneuz's name spread like wildfire through the legal guilds of Europe. He had achieved the impossible, defeating the power of the ecclesiastical court, using nothing but its own rulebook. He went on to become one of the most celebrated jurists of the 16th century, eventually rising to the prestigious position of First President of the Parlement of Provence. His defense of the rats was not just a clever trick. It became a foundational text in the evolution of Western law. In his legal treatise, the Concilia, he argued a principle that we take for granted today, that the law must protect the weak, that procedural fairness is absolute, and that no entity, no matter how despised, unclean, or destructive, can be condemned by a civilized society without a rigorous, objective, and unbiased defense. In a strange, twisted way, the modern framework of human rights and the right to a fair trial was forged in the cold, incense-filled air of a medieval cathedral, defending a population of grain-eating pests. As we close this chapter of the Gallows and Quill archive, we are left to look back at the fields of Autumn with a different perspective. Human history is rarely a straight line of progress. Often, our greatest leaps in logic, philosophy, and justice come from the most absurd corners of our past. The next time you walk past an old library or hear the faint midnight scratching behind the drywall, remember that under the right light and with the right lawyer, even the shadows beneath the floorboards can make fools of kings. The Gallows and Quill archive is just opening its doors. Subscribe. The next case file is already sealed and waiting.